Hey everyone, and welcome back to Chat Like a Native. You know that feeling, right? When you're stuck at the intermediate level and real fluency feels so far away.
Yeah, it can be frustrating.
Totally. So today, we're ditching the textbooks.
Oh, interesting.
We're going deep on something way more effective, storytelling. We'll uncover how stories can actually rewire your brain for fluency. Plus, we'll give you practical tips to craft compelling stories, even if you don't think you're a natural storyteller. Get ready to unleash your inner storyteller and finally chat like a native.
I think a lot of people get stuck with the traditional language learning methods.
For sure.
It's funny, though, real conversations, they don't follow those strict grammar rules we learn, right?
So true.
Yeah.
It's all about connection. And that's where storytelling comes in.
Exactly.
But I have to admit, sometimes it feels a bit intimidating, you know? Like, am I really supposed to be writing stories to improve my English?
I get it.
It seems almost too simple. How can just telling stories actually help us speak more naturally?
Well, it's all about your brain. Stories, they light up so many areas of your brain all at once.
Really?
Yeah, you're connecting emotions, imagery, logic, even sensory details. It's like a full brain workout.
So it's a more natural way to learn, like how we learned as kids.
Exactly. And there's actually a lot of research that shows that learners who use storytelling in their learning, they improve much faster, not just in fluency, but also in vocabulary, pronunciation, even grammar.
Wait, hold on. Are you saying that storytelling can improve my grammar? I always thought those were totally separate
Oh,
things.
no, right. But they're connected in a way that most people don't realize. Look, grammar is important. It's the framework. But storytelling teaches you how to actually use that framework. It's about context, understanding how language really flows in conversations.
Okay, so we're not throwing grammar out the window.
Right.
It's about using it in a meaningful way, not just memorizing rules.
Exactly. It's about moving past the textbook and into the real world. That's where storytelling comes in. It lets us practice language in a way that's fun and relevant to our lives.
Okay, I'm starting to see the bigger picture here. But for someone who's a little scared to start storytelling, where do they even begin?
Start small. You don't need to write a novel or anything. The magic is in the everyday stuff. Think about a simple experience. Maybe you tried a new recipe, had a funny chat with a neighbor, or saw something cool on your way to work. These are all stories waiting to be told.
So true. It's all about finding those little narratives in our daily lives.
Exactly.
But here's the thing that I find really interesting. At this stage, it's not even about perfect grammar, right? It's more about finding your voice, experimenting with the language, even making mistakes.
You got it. Sometimes focusing too much on grammar can actually make you less fluent. It makes you hesitant, afraid to take risks, and that stops the natural flow of language. With storytelling, it's all about communication, getting your message across. The grammar will come naturally as you get more comfortable.
That's such a relief to hear. It takes the pressure off. It lets us just enjoy playing with the language.
For sure.
But okay, let's say I'm ready to give storytelling a try. What are the essential ingredients of a good story, the kind that will really boost my English skills?
Every good story needs a few key things. Engaging characters, a conflict that keeps you interested, and a resolution that ties it all together. Like, imagine you're going on a hike with a friend. You're all excited, but then, halfway through, it starts pouring rain.
Oh no, so now you have a challenge, a conflict.
Exactly. And that's what makes the story interesting. So what do? Maybe you find shelter, have a laugh about it, and realize that the whole adventure was actually even better because of the rain.
I love that. It's such a relatable example, and the vocabulary is simple. You know, hiking, rain, shelter. But the story itself is what draws you in.
Right. It's not about fancy words. It's about connecting with people. And that connection is what makes language come alive. It's what helps you remember it.
So how do we actually use stories to improve our English, not just enjoy them passively?
I have this thing I call the 3-day storytelling challenge. Day 1, write a short story, maybe 50 to 100 words, about anything you want. Day 2, record yourself telling that story. Focus on your pronunciation and let the words flow naturally.
I like it. It's structured, but still leaves room to be creative.
Exactly. And day 3, the most important part, is sharing it. Tell a friend, a language partner, or even post it online. Sharing helps you solidify what you've learned and get feedback.
That's a great challenge. And as you get better, you can make your stories longer and more complex. But what about people who freeze up when they try to write a story? Any advice for getting over that?
Yeah, writer's block can be tough. even for native speakers.
I know, right?
But the thing is, it's usually because we're putting too much pressure on ourselves to be amazing from the start.
Right. To be perfect.
Exactly. Remember, the goal here is fluency, not writing a masterpiece.
Yeah, it's about the process.
Exactly. And sometimes the best way to get started is to just start with what you know.
That makes sense.
Instead of trying to come up with a whole new world, use your own life, your memories, things you've seen.
Like we talked about before, using those everyday moments.
Yeah, those are full of potential stories. But how do we make those stories actually help us with our English?
That's a good question.
One really good technique is what I call mining for gold. Take one of your stories and really break it down. Think about the main verbs. Are there any descriptive words you could add? Could you say a sentence in a different way, using different grammar?
So you're using the story to practice different ways of expressing the same idea.
That's it. It's like taking a simple sentence and making it better, using more interesting vocabulary, more complex grammar.
I see, like leveling up your sentences.
Exactly. But isn't there a risk? If we focus so much on storytelling, won't we make more grammar mistakes?
Yeah, I was wondering that too.
It's a good point. We don't want to completely ignore grammar. But remember, fluency isn't just about being correct. It's about communication.
Right, it's about getting your meaning across.
Exactly. So it's all about finding the right balance, being free to experiment with language, but still paying attention to the rules.
Like learning to dance.
Mm.
First you learn the steps, but then you start to feel the music, and you
Yeah.
can move more freely.
That's a great analogy. That's exactly what we're going for with language. Okay, let's go back to those techniques for improving storytelling skills. You mentioned shadowing earlier.
Oh yeah, what is that again?
Shadowing is amazing for your pronunciation, intonation, and fluency. It's like having a personal language coach. Basically, you listen to a recording of a native speaker telling a story, and you try to copy them exactly.
Wow, so you're really trying to mimic their sounds.
Yeah, you're training your ears and your mouth to work together to make those sounds that might be difficult at first.
Like copying a great painter to learn their technique.
Exactly. And the best thing is you can shadow anything. Podcasts, movies, audiobooks, even YouTube videos. Just choose something you enjoy listening to, something that keeps you motivated.
Yeah, that makes sense. What about practicing with language partners? How can we use storytelling with them?
Language partners are so important for learning a language, and storytelling is a great way to make those conversations even better. You could take turns telling each other stories, giving feedback, and helping each other.
Like a little storytelling club.
Exactly. You could even write stories together. Each person adds a sentence or a paragraph.
It sounds fun. But for some people, sharing their stories, especially with a native speaker, can be scary.
Yeah, I understand. But remember, it's about progress, not being perfect. Your language partner is there to support you, to help you learn. And with storytelling, you can connect on a deeper level, share your experiences in a way that goes beyond grammar rules.
That's so important. It's not about showing off perfect English. It's about using language to connect and communicate. That actually leads to another great thing about storytelling. It helps us get over the fear of making mistakes.
Absolutely. Fear is one of the biggest things that holds us back from being fluent. It makes us hesitate, feel self-conscious, and stops us from expressing ourselves.
Oh, I've been there for sure.
But storytelling helps us break free from that fear. Think about it. When you're telling a story, you're not just giving information, you're creating an experience. You're painting a picture with language, making people feel emotions, taking them to a different time and place.
And that helps us forget about ourselves and just focus on the story.
Exactly. It's not, am I speaking correctly? It's, am I keeping my listener interested? Am I sharing the emotions I want to share?
It's like we become the narrator of our own experiences.
That's a great way to put it. It allows us to relax, to not worry about being perfect, and to just enjoy communicating.
So it's about changing how we think about language.
Right.
Seeing it as a way to connect and express ourselves, not just a bunch of rules.
Exactly. I think that's important for anyone learning a language.
I agree.
Oh.
Before we move on to the last part of our deep dive, I wanted to talk about something you mentioned earlier. Storytelling as a way to improve fluency without even realizing it.
Ah, you mean embedding storytelling into our everyday conversations?
Yes, it's like rewiring our brains to think and speak in English naturally. But how does that actually work?
Think about it this way. When you tell a story, you're not just sharing information, you're creating an experience for the listener. You're using language to paint a picture, make them feel things, take them to a different place.
And if we use that same approach in our daily conversations,
Yeah,
we start to use the language on a much deeper level.
exactly. Instead of just saying basic things, we add more detail, more emotion. We make our conversations interesting and memorable.
So we're going beyond just exchanging information. We're creating experiences, even in simple conversations.
That's the idea. Imagine you're telling a friend about your commute. Instead of just saying, the train was crowded, you could say, I squeezed onto the train this morning, packed like sardines. But I managed to get a seat next to a nice old lady who shared her crossword puzzle with me.
That's so much better. It creates a real picture in your mind. It's so much more engaging than just stating a fact.
See, it's all about awareness. Pay attention to how native speakers talk. Listen for those little stories they weave into their conversations, how they use descriptive language to make their experiences come alive. Then start trying it yourself.
So we need to develop a storytelling mindset.
Exactly. Always be on the lookout for ways to make your conversations more interesting. Okay, let's get practical. What are some specific techniques we can use to make storytelling a regular part of our language learning? One technique I really like is retelling the highlights. Pick a story you've heard or read recently, maybe from a book, a movie, or even just a conversation. Then try to summarize it in your own words. Focus on the main events, the emotions, and try to remember the dialogue as best as you can.
So it's like creating a mini movie in your head and then describing it out loud.
Exactly. This is where you can really experiment with different tenses, vocabulary, and expressions. Don't worry about making mistakes. It's how we learn.
That's a great point. And we could apply this to so many different things. Like if you're watching a movie with English subtitles, you could pause it after a scene and try to summarize what happened. Focus on how the characters interacted and the main points of the plot.
Absolutely. And if you're reading a book, you could summarize a chapter to a friend or record yourself retelling the story. When you put it into your own words, it helps you really learn the language.
This reminds me of the 3-day storytelling challenge we talked about earlier. Could we use this retelling the highlights technique for the challenge?
Definitely. It's a perfect fit. Day 1, choose a story to retell. Day 2, record yourself telling it. Day 3, share it with a language partner or post it online.
That's a great idea. It combines creative storytelling and retelling in a really structured and fun way. But what about those times when we're not actively studying? How can we keep that storytelling mindset going in our daily lives?
It's about finding those little moments to turn everyday things into narratives. Like instead of just listing your weekend plans, try telling it as a short story. Describe the setting, introduce the people involved, and maybe even hint at a little conflict.
Wow, so even something as simple as talking about our plans can be a storytelling opportunity.
Exactly. The more you do it, the easier it becomes to think and speak in English naturally.
It's like turning our everyday lives into a language learning adventure. But before we wrap up, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how to deal with the fear of being judged, especially when sharing our stories with others.
That's a really important point. It's something a lot of language learners worry about. But the more you share your stories, the more confident you'll become. Remember, it's not about being perfect. It's about connecting with people. Your story doesn't have to be grammatically perfect to be interesting and meaningful.
It's so true. And when we focus on connection instead of perfection, it takes the pressure off and lets us enjoy sharing our experiences.
Exactly. Remember, your story is special. Your perspective, your voice, your experiences, those are what make your stories valuable. Don't be afraid to share them.
I love that. It's about being ourselves and using that as a strength in our language learning. So if we had to give our listeners one key takeaway from all of this, what would it be?
Embrace storytelling. It's not just a fun way to learn English. It's a powerful tool for becoming fluent, for connecting with others, and for finding your own voice in a new language.
I couldn't agree more. And I think that's a great place to end our conversation. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the world of storytelling for fluency. We hope you've learned some valuable insights and practical tips to take your English to the next level.
It's been great talking to you about this.
And remember, keep those stories coming.
Yeah, exactly. It's about making even those small moments come alive.
I see what you mean.
Yeah, so it all comes down to paying attention. Notice how native speakers talk, how they add little stories into their conversations, how they use descriptive words to really bring their experiences to life. And then try it out yourself.
So it's like building a storytelling muscle in our brains.
Yeah.
Always looking for opportunities to make our conversations more interesting.
Yes, that's it.
But let's get practical. What are some specific techniques we can use to actually integrate storytelling into our language learning routine?
One technique that I find really helpful is what I call retelling the highlights. Basically, choose a story you've recently come across, maybe from a book, a movie, or even just a conversation, and try to summarize it in your own words. Focus on the main events, the emotions involved, and see if you can remember the dialogue.
So it's like creating a little movie in your mind and then describing it out loud.
Exactly. And this is where you can really play with the language, experiment with different tenses, vocabulary, and expressions. And don't be afraid to make mistakes. It's all part of the learning process.
That makes sense. And I can see how this could be used in so many different ways. Like if you're watching a movie with English subtitles, you could pause after a scene and try to retell what just happened, paying attention to how the characters interacted and the key points of the story.
Absolutely. Or if you're reading a book, you could summarize a chapter to a friend, or even just record yourself retelling the story. Putting it into your own words helps you really absorb the language and make it your own.
This reminds me of something we talked about earlier, the 3-day storytelling challenge. Do you think we could incorporate this retelling the highlights technique into that challenge?
For sure. It's a perfect fit. On day 1, you could choose a story you want to retell. On day 2, you could record yourself narrating it. And then on day 3, you could share it with a language partner or post it online.
I love it. It combines both creative storytelling and the skill of retelling in a structured and fun way. But what about those times when we're not actively practicing? How can we keep that storytelling mindset going in our daily lives?
It's about finding those small opportunities to turn everyday interactions into mini narratives. For example, instead of just listing your weekend plans, try turning it into a little story. Set the scene, introduce the characters, and maybe even hint at a possible conflict.
Wow, so even something as simple as talking about our plans can become a storytelling opportunity.
Exactly. And the more you do it, the more natural it will become to think and speak in English, even when you're not consciously trying to.
It's like we're turning our daily lives into a language learning adventure. But before we wrap up this deep dive, I'd love to get your thoughts on how we can overcome the fear of being judged, especially when it comes to sharing our stories with others.
That's such a common fear for language learners, but I think the key is to just keep practicing and sharing your stories. Remember, it's not about being perfect. It's about connecting with people. Your story doesn't have to be grammatically flawless to be engaging and meaningful.
You're so right. And when we shift our focus from perfection to connection, it takes the pressure off and allows us to really enjoy sharing our experiences.
Exactly. Your story is unique. Your perspective, your voice, your experiences, those are the things that make your story special. Don't be afraid to let them shine through.
I love that. It's about embracing our individuality and using it as a strength in our language learning journey. So if we could boil all of this down to one key takeaway for our listeners, what would it be?
Embrace the power of storytelling. It's not just a fun way to learn English. It's a powerful tool for unlocking fluency, for connecting with others, and for finding your own unique voice in a new language.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And on that note, I want to thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the world of storytelling for fluency. We hope you've learned some valuable insights and practical tips to take your English to the next level.
It's great chatting with you.
And remember, keep those stories coming. Until next time, keep chatting, keep connecting, and keep practicing your English.